Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining this week's session of the Peace Research Colloquium hosted by Swiss Peace and the Graduate School for Social Sciences at the University of Basel. It's great to again see so many familiar faces here and to be able to welcome Dr. Govinda Clayton, who will give today's talk. And so without further ado, I'm really happy that Dr. Govinda Clayton is here with us today to present research on ceasefires in intrastate conflicts. We've had a lot of different sessions already about various aspects of peace building, peacemaking. We haven't really touched on ceasefires yet, so this is really exciting. Govinda is a senior researcher at the ETH Zurich at the Center for Security Studies. He's published really widely in top journals on various issues related to peace negotiations, mediation, dialogue, conflict management, and conflict resolution. He's also the executive director of CRS, the Conflict Research Society in the UK, and is today presenting a research project on ceasefires, which is conducted in collaboration with PRIO, the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, and Uppsala University, and has also been engaged in a lot of dialogues with or exchanges with policymakers, which might be of interest to many in the audience. So thanks, Govinda, and over to you. We're curious to hear about your research. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much. And thanks so much to everybody for being here today. Thank you to Swiss Peace for putting this on. It's a real honor to be speaking as a part of this colloquium. I think it's a really great initiative, and I'm a little bit humbled and nervous to follow so many great speakers in the program already, and I'm looking forward to joining some of the future sessions. So thanks very much, and let me just start my slides. Awesome. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about ceasefires and intrastate conflict, what, where, when, and why. But first of all, a kind of short disclaimer that nothing that I'm going to be talking about today is solely my own work. In fact, every single part of this project is collaborative. And so I'm not going to kind of flag each of the people that have been involved in each of the different bits, but more generally, this is the result of ongoing collaborations with Valerie Stickler, Simon Mason, and Claudia Wieler from the Center for Security Studies, where I work. Also, Siriam Rushdud, Hubert Negard, Hubert Strand from Peace Research Institute in Oslo, Colin Barter from Uppsala, and Laurie Nathan from University of Notre Dame. So it's very much a team effort here. But of course, any of the mistakes that I discussed today are solely my own. I also want to give a special thanks to Julian Hottinger and Georg Stein from the Swiss FDFA, who've been really instrumental in developing various parts of this project. So as we go along, you'll see at the bottom of the slides, I'll relate to various different papers. I'm not going to talk about that, but if there's a particular bit you're interested in, just let me know and I'm happy to send you over the paper. So today I'm going to talk to you about the Ceasefire Project. The Ceasefire Project came about around 4 years ago, and it originated in a discussion between the Swiss FDFA and the mediation support team at ETH Zurich. And they were doing a piece of work and preparing a paper, and they thought they'd look for what research academics had put together on the topic of ceasefires. And what they quickly realized was actually there's surprisingly little research on this topic. And so even though ceasefires intuitively seem to be this really important part of a peace process, we didn't actually know very much about what type of effects they were having. And so as a result, we decided to develop a project. And little did we know, at the same time, researchers at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo were having an identical conversation with their MFA as well. And so the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway also were really interested in learning more about ceasefires, but couldn't really find any research. So we quickly joined forces with them, and then shortly afterwards with Uppsala University. And so this project, right from the very start, has been a collaboration between practitioners and academics. And so I think it fits really nicely with Swiss Peace that obviously straddles both of those worlds very nicely as well. And so the kind of three questions that we've been focusing on as part of this project is firstly, with regards to the kind of onset of ceasefires. So where, when, why, and under what conditions are ceasefires enacted? Secondly, what are the kind of consequences of ceasefires? So how do ceasefires then subsequently impact conflict violence? And finally, which is kind of the end point that we're aiming towards, how do ceasefires affect peace processes and vice versa? So how do peace processes affect ceasefires? So today I'm going to focus mainly on this first question of the kind of when, where, and why do ceasefires occur. So mainly on the onset question, and towards the end, I'll talk a little bit about what the consequences are for violence. But the work with regards to peace processes is still largely ongoing. And at the end, I'll maybe make a few references to that. So again, just to mention, in addition to the team, we've had more than 25 research assistants who've worked on this project. So I just want to acknowledge them and say thanks to them for all of their hard work if they're watching today. So over the course of the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to make a number of points, and I'm going to shoot through lots of different stuff that we found out. So I want to be really clear on what the 4 take-home points are. Some psychology research has suggested that we need to hear something about 20 times before it really enters into our memory. So I'm going to try my hardest over the course of the next 90 minutes to make these points 20 times. So I hope you don't get too bored of them. So firstly, with regards to the what I want to show you today is that ceasefires really can mean very different things in different contexts and to different people. And so it's really important that when we're talking about ceasefires, we're clear exactly what we mean. Secondly, with regards to the where, I want to show you today that ceasefires are perhaps a surprisingly common feature in almost all intrastate conflicts, though perhaps less now than in previous years. Thirdly, with regards to the when, I want to show you that actually there are some relatively consistent patterns in terms of when ceasefires occur. So there are certain points and conditions in a conflict that do tend to correlate quite highly with the onset of the ceasefire. And finally, with regards to the why, I want to show you that the motivations for ceasefires vary greatly and that this impacts the design of their agreements. So the reasons why conflict parties enter into a ceasefire shapes the type of ceasefire that we see and then ultimately how successful they are. So I'm going to come back to them points repeatedly. So firstly, let's begin with this question of what is a ceasefire? And I think when we first began this project, we kind of adopted the Justice Potter Stewart method. So he was the judge in the US who famously said that he can't really define pornography, but he knows what it is when he sees it. And it was a bit the same with ceasefires, that we all kind of knew what we were talking about, but actually it became surprisingly difficult to actually clearly conceptualize them. And the reason why that was is because what a ceasefire is really depends upon who you ask. There is no uniformly agreed definition of a ceasefire. So firstly, if you look at the media tend to refer to a ceasefire as anything that kind of smells like it might try and stop violence at some point. So that includes a whole range of arrangements that might relate to prisoner exchanges or limiting violence in different types of ways, up to full-on peace agreements. So the media is not perhaps the most accurate source in terms of clearly conceptualizing this, as you would expect. But unfortunately, we can't really blame just journalists for this problem, because even in the research community, there's lots of conceptual ambiguity about what a ceasefire actually is. So for example, in probably the most important work on ceasefires so far that was undertaken by Paige Fortner in the early 2000s, she defined ceasefire as a kind of end or break in the fighting. And so as a result, she never actually distinguished between ceasefires that attempt to stop violence completely and those agreements that just attempt to produce a temporary pause. Now, for her work, this wasn't really that important because she was focusing on interstate conflict. And so in interstate conflict, when a ceasefire takes place, the parties can retreat behind their lines and it can act as a de facto peace agreement or not. It's not so important. Whereas in intrastate conflict, this distinction between agreements that take place during conflict and agreements that take place to try and end conflict is really important. If we look instead at the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, which is the premium source of conflict data, we see that they define ceasefires as one of 4 possible outcomes. So they say conflicts can end in one of 4 ways. It can either end through a military victory, it can end through a peace agreement, it can end through by dropping underneath some fatality threshold, or through a ceasefire. So this is a kind of useful definition if you're interested in or how conflicts end. But again, it misses those ceasefires that take place during conflict that are part of the violent dynamics. And mediation practitioners, so for example, our colleagues in the FDFA, they adopt a very narrow definition of a ceasefire. So for mediation practitioners, a ceasefire is a very formal agreement with very specific provisions, often including some method to monitor compliance, normally external monitoring, and it almost always takes place as part of a larger negotiation process. But just to complexify things even more, they use a certain amount of linguistic flexibility in what they call things. And that's because the term ceasefire can often be politicized. And as a result of that, they might have to call something that you or I might consider a ceasefire by a different name, like a humanitarian pause, in order to move the parties towards an agreement. So in our project, we use ceasefire as a kind of umbrella term. So it captures a full range of different arrangements. So for us, a ceasefire is any arrangement that includes a statement by at least one conflict party that they intend to stop violence, temporarily or permanently, from a specific point in time. So we capture underneath ceasefires a kind of broad family of arrangements that includes things like truces, cessation of hostilities, preliminary ceasefires, humanitarian pauses, permanent peace agreement ceasefires, and the like. What we exclude is what you might call de-escalation agreements. So it's other agreements that attempt to limit or mitigate violence in some way, but don't attempt to ultimately stop it. And so, for example, in Colombia, in the peace process between the FARC and the Colombian government, there was a series of confidence-building measures agreed that limited certain forms of violence, but didn't attempt to ultimately stop it. And so those would be excluded from our definition. But while we use a broad definition for ceasefire, we then think about different types of characteristics, so different adjectives that we could add on to our concept in order to divide it up in different types of ways. So, for example, we look at different geographic coverage. So is a ceasefire a national agreement, a regional agreement, or a local agreement? In terms of inclusivity, is it a unilateral agreement? Is it bilateral or multilateral? In terms of formality, is it a written agreement or a verbal agreement? And importantly, in terms of its temporal scope. So is this a temporary agreement that takes place during conflict as part of the bargaining, or is it a permanent agreement that's meant to end the violent phase of an incompatibility? So just to repeat my first kind of point, the first kind of thing that I really want you to remember when you look back to this talk in the days and weeks to come is that ceasefire really means something different. And so if you're doing research on ceasefires, or if you're working with ceasefires in a more practical capacity, it's really important to be clear on exactly what we mean when we refer to a ceasefire. So secondly, where are ceasefires occurring? So when we first began this project, we thought it would be relatively easy to find out where and when different types of ceasefires are taking place. But what we quickly found out is that the research the existing research didn't offer any solid evidence in this regard. And that's because most research up to this point tends to focus on ceasefires that take place during interstate conflict. I already mentioned the work of Paige Fortner that's particularly important in this area. So while we might know a little bit about where and when ceasefires are taking place in interstate conflict, we didn't really know that with regards to civil conflict. There's also another branch of really useful and interesting literature that's taken place in the last few years that does focus on civil conflicts, but it tends to be limited to either individual cases or small case comparisons. So, for example, the work of Mylene Akivo has been really important in this regard, but she tended to focus predominantly on the Philippines and Aceh. There's been other important work recently by Waterman looking more at India, and other work focusing on Israel. So we know a few cases a few countries and contexts in which these fires are taking place, but not more generally. So what we really lacked was systematic global studies of where or when parties enter into these arrangements. So what we did is we tried to find more. So attempting to locate ceasefires. How we did this is first of all, we studied a variety of news reports. So we used a program called Factiva, which collates various different news, it's kind of news repository. And we searched for any news reports, both international and local sources, that use the words ceasefire, cessation of hostility, truce, all of the various different terms I mentioned just a second ago. And that gave us a somewhat daunting number of about 1.25 million news reports. So what we originally intended to be a 6 to 9 month data collection project has taken 4 years and counting. So we did develop a kind of computer-assisted approach to help us lift relevant sentences out of these reports, but essentially each of these reports, and these are kind of examples of Reuters and BBC reports here, they range from about 1 page to up to 20 pages, have all been read by one of our research assistants, which is why we have had a small army of research assistants working on this project. So after we studied each of these news reports, we used the definition that I set out for you a second ago, so an explicitly declared intention by at least one conflict party to stop hostilities from a specific point in time. And then we recorded all of these arrangements. So our data set, which we've called the Civil Conflict Ceasefire data set, covers the temporal period of 1989 to 2018. We've actually also coded 2019 and 2020 up to this point. And so in January of next year, when we release the data, we're going to be releasing it up to 2020. So that means we're also in the full released version of the data going to be covering all of the COVID-related ceasefires. And so if people have questions or queries about that, feel free to throw them at me in the Q&A. The data set is global, so we cover all conflicts that are included within the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. So that's 155 intrastate conflicts in total. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to kind of give you a link to this online page. And on this page, you can have a play around with different countries. You can see when the ceasefires were signed. You can see what the different characteristics of the agreements were. But an important thing to note is that ceasefires are relational. So you can't really have a ceasefire unless you have somebody to call the ceasefire against. So as a result of that, we had to think carefully about exactly how we structure the data. And so as a result of that, we have different kind of clusters of ceasefires within the data. So for example, firstly, we might have a unilateral arrangement in which the government signs a ceasefire towards a particular non-state group. Or we might have a unilateral arrangement where the government calls a ceasefire to multiple non-state groups, as we recently saw in Myanmar last year, for example. On other occasions, we might have a non-state group declaring a ceasefire towards the government, which we saw with the ELN in Colombia at the start of the COVID crisis. Or we might have more what we call reciprocated unilateral ceasefires. So in the Philippines, for example, most Christmases, actually, if you've been following the news the last few days, it looks like not this Christmas, but most Christmases, the government of the Philippines and the communist armed organization have both declared ceasefires at the same time, but they haven't negotiated a process. They've just been reciprocated unilateral arrangements. On other cases, we have bilateral arrangements, which are the more conventional ceasefires where there's a formal negotiation process and the parties sign an agreement together. Or finally, we might have multilateral ceasefires where the government and multiple non-state groups, again, all sign onto an agreement together. So, for example, the nationwide ceasefire agreement in Myanmar would be this last example. So when we look at the data, this is kind of what we come up with, and I'll have a sip of water while you take it in. So on this map, it's a world map, which you're probably familiar with. In the grey, we see countries that have not seen any civil conflict between 1989 and 2018. In the yellow are countries in which there have been some civil conflict, according to the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, but there haven't been any ceasefires. And so we can see here that this features mainly in Latin America, China, and then countries that have suffered from you might call isolated conflicts. So, for example, the United States with the 9/11 attacks that were classified by Uppsala as a conflict, which is a relatively contestable claim. But what I think is clear from this, if you look at the oranges and moving into the purples, is that most countries that have had a civil conflict at some point have seen some kind of ceasefires, on average between 20 and 70 ceasefires. And there's also a number of cases. So, for example, we can see Sudan, Israel, India, and the Philippines have had more than 150 ceasefires in this period. But what we can't really tell from this map is like when these ceasefires took place. So instead, we can here represent the regional distribution of ceasefires across time. So starting with 1989, moving all the way through into 2018. And we see which region the different shares of ceasefires were. And so actually what we see, quite luckily, is it's quite intuitive, the different distributions that we see. So in the early 1990s, we see predominantly ceasefires in the Americas. This is associated with conflicts like Guatemala, El Salvador, and in Colombia. In the early 1990s, ceasefires tended to center in Europe, of course, focused mainly on the Balkan crisis. In the early 2000s, we see ceasefires focusing predominantly in Africa with conflicts like the DRC and Sudan. And more recently, ceasefires have tended to cluster in the Middle East, in particular of conflicts like Yemen, Syria, and Afghanistan. We've also a kind of slight upsurge in Europe relating predominantly to the Ukraine. So perhaps the most self-evident piece of information you've ever been presented, ceasefires are more likely to be taking place where conflicts are occurring. However, the pattern's actually not quite that straightforward. So here what I'm showing you is a graph that depicts the number of conflicts in each year with the share of those conflicts that saw a ceasefire in that year. So, for example, in 1989, there was 38 conflicts according to the UCDP data. In 1990, there was 48, etc. And so, as most of us are aware, in the early 1990s, we saw a peak of conflict with the end of the Cold War that then declined rapidly in the kind of end of history period and the Better Angels of Our Nature being written around about here. And then more recently, we've seen an upsurge in conflicts in making the last 3 or 4 years some of the most violent years in the UCDP data. But the pattern we've seen with ceasefires is really quite interesting here. So while in the early 1990s, we had a lot of conflicts, but we also saw a lot of ceasefires. In the last few years, the increase in conflict has not been met by an associated increase in ceasefires. So this is really quite fascinating. It's all the more interesting because if there was to be any biases in our data, we'd expect the biases to be the other way around. We'd expect that it'd be harder for us to find ceasefires in this period where there wasn't so much news reporting and perhaps the internet wasn't so developed. Whereas in this period, we'd expect that we should be capturing almost everything. So the fact that we find less ceasefires in the last 3 years is particularly puzzling. Now, we haven't done kind of specific research to explain this yet, but we could certainly speculate with regards to the work of Lisa Howard recently and one of the former Swiss peace colleagues, Sarah Hellmüller, that's looked at the importance of geopolitical considerations and how that's reshaping peace processes. Could also think about the work of Isaac Svensson and Magnus Lundsen, who have shown that mediation has become a lot less frequent in recent years, and that the nature of conflict itself has shifted to be fought around different issues. So in particular, conflicts fought around religious issues tend to have proven to be more resistant to mediation and other forms of peacemaking. And so potentially what we could be picking up here is that. But that's all just speculation at this point. I think it's a kind of really interesting empirical pattern. And so if you're a master's student out there watching this today, this could be a really interesting thing to focus on in the thesis. Oh yeah, this bit, that's the important bit. Okay, so the second kind of thing I want you to remember, the first one, remember, was that ceasefires mean different things in different contexts, different times. The second, with regards to the where, is that ceasefires are a really common feature. So almost all, like more than 90% of the conflict in the UCDP data see a ceasefire at some point, and most of them feature multiple ceasefires, though perhaps now less so than in the recent past. This is something that I think we need to dig into a little bit further. So now I want to turn to the question of when do conflict parties enter into a ceasefire? So to put it differently, like what are the correlates of ceasefires? Now, in some of our work, the first thing we did in this area is we turned to the qualitative research and we looked for what are the various different theoretical mechanisms that have been put together to explain when ceasefires occur. So if you're interested, you can kind of check out the paper and we go into much more depth on the theory. But here I want to just present to you the kind of the empirical findings that we have and give you some indication of what that might mean. And we can go back to this in the Q&A if you're interested. So the first thing, the reason why you might expect to see ceasefires occur relates to conflict violence. So as conflicts become more violent, we might expect the likelihood of a ceasefire to increase. And this might be for different reasons. It might be on the one hand because as the costs of conflict increase, in a way similar to, in alignment with Zartman's theory of hurting stalemate, it might be that the parties begin to see the benefits of looking towards a peace agreement. On the other hand, it might be that as conflict violence increases, the conflict parties require a kind of pause in the violence in order to rearm, regroup, or recruit new members. So this is the first thing that we wanted to look into. And so you can see here on the left-hand side, this is a graph of how many fatalities there were. So these are battle-related fatalities, predominantly those of the armed forces on either side, in each month. And on the y-axis here, we see the prediction of how likely it is to see a ceasefire occur, so 10%, 20, 30%. So you can see that in a month in which there's no conflict violence, there's about a 5% chance of a ceasefire occurring, which is a relatively low probability. As violence increases, so as we see higher levels of violence in a month, the likelihood of a ceasefire also increases. But the quite striking thing that we see here is that we need a lot of violence and a lot of fatalities for it to really exert a substantive effect on the likelihood of a ceasefire. So moving from no fatalities in a month to a really violent month where 500 people die, the likelihood of a ceasefire increases only to about 8 or 9%. So it's a relatively modest increase. I should say that I'm not going to kind of go into the methods. We can talk about that more in the Q&A if you're interested, but these are using the most conservative and robust measures we possibly can. However, what we do find, though, interestingly, is that while battle-related fatalities exert a relatively small impact on the likelihood of a ceasefire, civilian fatalities seem to have a really quite sizable effect. So moving from no civilian fatalities to 50 civilian fatalities in a month doubles the likelihood that we'll see a ceasefire. So this might be because conflicts in which civilians are targeted are those most likely to garner international attention and pressure from the international community to enter into an arrangement. However, unfortunately, we also found a kind of worrying nuance to this if we think about contemporary conflicts that are going on around the world at the moment. So while in cases in which the state involved in a civil conflict does not receive any type of external support, this pattern holds up. So we see that if the state does not receive external support, an increase in civilian fatalities has a really strong impact on the likelihood of a ceasefire. However, in those cases in which a state is supported by another state in their armed conflict, so we think, for example, of Yemen, of Syria, of Ukraine and others, in that case, maybe not Ukraine actually, but definitely in Yemen and Syria, and in that case, civilian fatalities have no effect, and if anything, they have a negative effect on the likelihood of a ceasefire. So to kind of to kind of repeat the key point here, like an increase in violence against civilians increases the likelihood of a ceasefire unless the state is supported by another actor, and in which case it has no effect. I think this is quite interesting and has kind of important policy implications. On the other hand, when non-state groups are supported by an outside party, it doesn't shift the relationship at all. If anything, those non-state groups who are supported by other states are actually a little bit more likely to enter into a ceasefire. Okay, turning now to other kind of characteristics of the conflict beyond the levels of violence. We think, well, is there an opportune moment in terms of the timing of a conflict at which ceasefires might be more likely to occur? So we look at what the likelihood of ceasefires occurring at different points in time. So in this graph here, again, we have the same y-axis with the likelihood of a ceasefire occurring. And on the x-axis, we have months since the beginning of the conflict. And what we see is by far the time in which we are most likely to observe a ceasefire is the first month of a conflict. In fact, in the first month of a conflict, the likelihood of a ceasefire is around about 11%. But then every month that increases for the first 6 or 7 months, that probability declines by around about 2%. So by the time we get to about 6 months into a conflict, the likelihood of a ceasefire is at a kind of all-time low. And it then takes about 3 or 4 years until the likelihood of a ceasefire starts to rise again. So how we interpret that is early on in the dispute, once the initial violent activities have undertaken, the parties have kind of tested their resolve and their capabilities against each other. And at this moment, as problems of information and the parties have started to understand each other's capacities and their willingness a little bit more, there's a high likelihood of a ceasefire occurring. But if a ceasefire doesn't occur in that period, or if a resolution doesn't occur and the conflict continues, you then enter into a more protracted period where the participants enter into a longer period of conflict to demonstrate their resolve on the battlefield. And this takes a few years until the parties are willing to start considering entering into a ceasefire again. Another aspect that we think is really interesting relates to elections. And so we don't find any particular effect with regards to the characteristics of a state. So whether a state is democratic or non-democratic doesn't seem to have any strong impact on the likelihood of a ceasefire occurring. However, what we do find is when within a democratic system, a new leader comes to power, this strongly increases the likelihood of a ceasefire. So in the first few days after a new leader is elected, ceasefires are at their most likely, above 10% likely, so double the normal kind of baseline level. And this continues in a declining rate up until about a year. And after about a year, democratic leaders become no more or less likely to enter into a ceasefire. So this does, I think, have some implications in terms of potential entry points for mediators or for those seeking to resolve conflict. It looks like the very early phases of a conflict and the period after the new election of a leader might be particularly susceptible and open to an agreement. You can imagine that the new leaders might not have the same baggage and the same sunk costs that old leaders might have. And finally, we look a little bit at, in terms of the when, we look a little bit at like the external factors that might influence whether a ceasefire occurs. So the first of which, we look at religious holidays. So just looking at the anecdotal and the case-based evidence, religious holidays often seem to be important moments because they provide an opportunity for the parties to send a peaceful signal to each other that's widely accepted by the population. So it wouldn't necessarily be perceived as a concession to the other side, but more a gesture in alignment with higher levels of religiosity. And what we actually see is that this is a relatively notable effect of 2% increase in the likelihood of a ceasefire. But because these factors are regularly occurring, this is actually quite an important effect. So we can see here, this photo is a picture of the Eid ceasefire that took place between the Taliban and the Afghan government last year as one example of this effect. We also see that mediation, as we might expect, and we see two famous mediators here, Kofi Annan and Marty Atazadeh, also has an increase in likelihood of a ceasefire, but again, relatively modest of around about 2%. But of course, mediation can continue for a number of months, maybe even for a year. So the cumulative effect of mediation could actually be very important still. So in terms of the when, what I want you to kind of recall here is that there are actually some relatively consistent patterns. So in particular, for those working to resolve conflict, that you could consider these as potential entry points or relatively ripe moments in which a context might be riper for some kind of ceasefire process. And to recall, these are periods during periods of intense violence, in particular when civilians are the victims and when there's no external support. Also early in the dispute, during mediation, religious holidays, or shortly after the election of a new leader. Okay, so now we're getting to what I think is the most interesting part of this presentation. And that's the why question. Like, why is it the conflict parties choose to enter into a ceasefire? So if we want to find out why conflict parties enter into a ceasefire, the most obvious thing we can do is we can look at, well, what do they say when they enter into a ceasefire? And so in the data, we coded what was the kind of purpose of the ceasefire as set out by the conflict parties. And these were the kind of key categories that we kind of came up with. It was in a small number of cases, elections, so ceasefires occurred called to allow elections to take place. In other cases, it relates to religious holidays, for the reasons I just set out just a second ago, for humanitarian concerns, or the kind of vast majority of cases is something to do with the peace process. So that's kind of encouraging, but not particularly surprising, and doesn't really tell us very much about the individual motivations, rather than it's kind of related to a peace process. So in this context, we can't really take the parties' own statements of why they're entering into a process, and we need instead to turn to theory. So to develop a theory, we first of all had to think about different types of ceasefire arrangements. Now, at the start of this presentation, I've been very clear that ceasefires mean lots of different things. And in all of the analysis that I've shown you so far, we've been considering ceasefires as a whole, so including all of the various different types of ceasefires that we might have. But in order to theorize about the why question, about what are the motivations for parties to enter into an arrangement, we need to think about the different characteristics of ceasefire agreements. And so for here, our discussions with Julian Hottinger and Georg Stein were particularly useful, and they really helped us to understand what perhaps some of the key categories of ceasefires are. So the first category we came up with was the cessations of hostility arrangements. So these are what you might call the simplest ceasefires, simplest in form, not necessarily in terms of how to negotiate. So these are arrangements where at least one conflict party opts to suspend violence, but there's no provisions to monitor compliance or the behaviour of the parties, and definitely no provisions to disarm or demobilise any of the belligerents. So these are the relatively simple arrangements. They might be verbal, they can sometimes be written, but if they are written, they'll tend to be very short, one page or very rarely more. The second class of ceasefires we talk about, and this is lifted directly from Julian's thinking, is what we call preliminary ceasefires. Now, these are preliminary in the sense that they're preparing the parties for an ultimate peace agreement. So preliminary ceasefires are much more formal arrangements between conflict parties to suspend violence that include some compliance mechanisms, such as, for example, monitoring or verification, in order to check that the parties are doing what they actually said they were doing. But again, they don't include measures to disarm or demobilise the belligerents. So an example of this would be the ceasefire that the government of Nepal and the Maoist group signed in 2006 that set the kind of tone and context for the negotiations that would continue in the following years. And finally, the final kind of class of ceasefires we talk about is what we might call definitive ceasefires. And these are the most kind of formal and detailed forms of ceasefires that set out the terms to permanently terminate the conflict violence. So these are often called peace agreement ceasefires or permanent ceasefires, and they often occur as a part of or as an appendix to a peace agreement. So, for example, the 2016 agreement signed between the government of Colombia and the FARC included within it a definitive ceasefire that set out the terms under which the FARC were to demobilise. Okay, so we've got our three classes of agreement. We've got cessation of hostilities, we've got preliminary ceasefires, and we've got definitive ceasefires. So what might be the logic or what might be the motivation? What is the why that parties might choose to enter into these arrangements? And so Valerie Stipler and I have been working on this topic. So we come up with three kind of separate logics that would relate to each of these different agreements. So the first logic we relate to is signalling intent. So the idea here is that during conflict, when the parties don't have access to full information on the other side, they suffer from what is sometimes called the asymmetric information problem. They know what they want and they know how strong they are, but they don't know what the other side wants and how strong they are. So in this case, ceasefires might be used in order to signal an intention to move towards considering a peace agreement. Now, this might occur firstly because the parties actually do genuinely want to move towards a peace agreement, or it might occur because the parties have become war weary and want to use this as a kind of bargaining tactic in order to improve their position. But in either case, whether the parties are looking to send a peaceful signal genuinely or in a more kind of devious sense or somewhere in the middle, they wouldn't want to necessarily invest significant time and resources to put in place costly compliance monitoring. And so as a result, a cessation of hostility agreement would probably be the favoured option. However, in other cases, parties might want to use a ceasefire to support an ongoing negotiation process. So in this case, the incentives of the parties have shifted. So they now see that there is a utility in moving towards a peace agreement, and they want to put a ceasefire in place in order to protect the process. It's really hard to negotiate a peace agreement when battlefield violence continues. The fronts are shifting all the time, and the kind of animosity and the hatred is continually reinforced by the process from the battlefield. So in this context, you might want to create a ceasefire in order to protect or support the negotiations. And in this case, it would be essential to have some kind of monitoring in order to make sure that the parties are actually sticking to an arrangement. So in this case, when parties want to support negotiations, we'd imagine a preliminary ceasefire would be the most effective. And finally, at the end of the process, when the parties are close to agreeing the contested issues and resolving the broader incompatibility sufficiently to move from the violent phase of conflict, then they would need to enter into an agreement to dismantle the status of war. So in order to set out the terms under which normally the non-state group would demobilise or the state's armed forces would be restructured in some way. And in this case, a definitive ceasefire is what would be needed. So we have three classes of ceasefire for three different logics. So what we then suggest is that if we have these different ceasefire logics, these by themselves are going to have an impact on the way in which the ceasefire is likely to impact violence. So if the parties decide to enter into a ceasefire because they want to protect a peace process, they're perhaps more likely to observe that than if they want to send a signal of peaceful intent. But equally, at the same time, the logic of the ceasefire, as I just set out a moment ago, shapes the ceasefire design. And there's been some interesting work that's pointed to the importance of monitoring as a tool. In fact, Fortner's work in looking at interstate conflict showed that ceasefire monitoring can increase the duration of arrangements. So we suggest that both the reason why the parties enter into an agreement and the design of a ceasefire both collectively influence how long and how effective ceasefires are. So in order to test this, we turn to the PAX data, which is the Peace Agreements Settlements Program data. If you've not seen it, you can check it out on the University of Edinburgh's webpage. It's a fantastic resource that includes all of the written agreements for all different types of peace agreements, both full peace agreements to ceasefires to process agreements and the like. And they have the full text versions of the documents. So we read about 600 ceasefire agreements, and we classified them all as either cessation of hostility, preliminary ceasefires, or definitive ceasefires. And this is kind of what we came up with. And this is a survival model. So these models were developed in order for medical people, for real doctors, to test the impact of their intervention. So if you take the red pill or the blue pill, how long a patient's likely to survive for. So what we're interested in here is how long does ceasefire survive for? But in order to check, like, well, how long does ceasefire survive? You have to decide, well, what does the death of a ceasefire mean? So what we decide is that the death of a ceasefire is when violence returns to a specific point of time. Now, there are problems with this kind of method of defining success. And if you're interested, please do ask me a question, and I can refer to some of our other work that we've been looking at to conceptualize ceasefire success. But all ceasefires do attempt to stop violence. And so I think it's still a useful way of thinking about it. And so in this case, in this graph, we look at how long was it from the point at which a ceasefire was signed until there were 25 fatalities in the conflict. And so here we start from the day the ceasefire was signed, and we go up in month durations. And this is how many ceasefires remained under the 25 battle-related threshold. This is 100, this is 80, 60, 40, or 20%. And so what we can see in terms of definitive ceasefires is they remain relatively stable. So after 90 days, after 3 months, we can see that about 84, 83% of definitive ceasefires remained in effect, so hadn't crossed that battle-related threshold. Whereas at the same time, preliminary ceasefires in that same 3-month period, only 70% of them had managed to keep violence below 25 battle-related deaths. Whereas cessation of hostility arrangements, so those arrangements that don't include any monitoring provisions, we can see that only about 42% are surviving after only 3 months. If we kind of fast forward to the end of the year, so after 360 days, we can see a kind of very clear picture emerging here. So the definitive arrangements, still about 65, 70% of these arrangements remain in effect, so have managed to keep battle-related fatalities below 25. And that's broadly in alignment with the peace agreement literature that suggests about 70% of peace agreements tend to hold. Whereas the preliminary ceasefires, only about 50%, but still a relatively respectable 50%, have managed to keep violence below the 25 related battle death threshold. Whereas cessation of hostility agreements or arrangements, we can see that after a year, only about 20% have survived. So 80% of the arrangements have broken down. So we can really see some evidence that these are more about sending a signal, and we don't necessarily, cessation of hostility arrangements are about sending a signal, which we don't expect to necessarily translate to a long-term reduction in violence. Preliminary ceasefires do seem to be much more effective at reducing violence, but still only about half of them remain in effect after a year. Whereas definitive ceasefires, as we would expect, as peace agreement ceasefires, do tend to keep violence down for longer periods. And this also really stresses the importance of the first point I was making about it's important to think about what we think about ceasefires. And previous research kind of collapsed these definitive ceasefires with all the other types of arrangements. So I think this shows not just importance in terms of the logic of why ceasefires occur, but also the importance about thinking about what is it that's actually in these arrangements. So this was my kind of final point, which is, so the motivations for entering into ceasefire vary greatly. It could be about signaling intent, it can be about protecting a process, or it could be about ending the status of war. This impacts both the design of the arrangement, so what goes into it. Does it become a cessation of hostility arrangement, a preliminary ceasefire, or a definitive ceasefire? But also how successful these arrangements ultimately are. So there's the 4 points. So if you're interested in learning more, of course, for those of you that are in the room now, we have a chance to have a Q&A that I'm really excited to hear what questions you have. But if you're watching a video on YouTube afterwards, then please do check out css.ethz.ch or the sister page on the Creo website if you're interested. And if you're interested in playing around with that data, you can do this on your phone or your laptop. The webpage is beta.creo.org/ceasefires. And there you can select a different country. You can see when the arrangements were, what day they were called, and you can also compare it to what happened with battlefield violence. So just finally, I want to kind of close by touching where we're going with this project. So we're 4 years into the project now, and we still have lots of questions to answer. So today I've really tried to give you a glimpse as much as possible into the what, where, when, and why ceasefires occur. But some of these other questions that I alluded to at the start, we still haven't really addressed. And so, for example, we're still really interested to know, how do ceasefires impact violence dynamics? So before, during, and after they occur. And so to answer this question, we've developed a new type of statistical method that accounts for the selection. So next year, we're going to be hopefully be able to present some of those results. We're also really interested in what the interaction is between ceasefire and the peace process. So this was, I think is a really important element that we really want to get to the bottom of. And so for this, we've undertaken 12 case studies that have been co-authored by my colleagues at CSS with mediators and conflict parties, including Sarah Helmler, who's one of your former colleagues. And we're also interested in sequencing ceasefires and new innovations in monitoring, and sort of working with conciliation resources on that topic as well. So that's what we've got coming up. So maybe, Dana, in 2 or 3 years' time, you can invite me back and I will share some more of these findings with you. But that's it. And so thank you very much for listening today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing some of your questions.